We are going to talk today about wide receivers that you should be avoiding at their current ADP in fantasy football drafts. And I think these ones might touch a nerve or two. I think they're interesting players. There's some of them that are players that I really, really like as players, but the ADP is getting a little bit out of control. So we're going to talk about who you should be avoiding. The first one up is Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if you agree with me or not on this one. He is somebody who last year had a very solid season, I guess we'll say, with Carson Wentz as his quarterback, who I don't think either of us are fans of Carson Wentz as a quarterback, but he is currently underdog ADP of 34, and then that makes him just a late second round pick in terms of ADP, which I think is vastly too high in terms of his ADP. When we look then over at the FFPC, he's going in the late third round at pick 44. In terms of positional ADP, that makes him wide receiver 15 in terms of current drafting. Now, he has got an upgrade, in my opinion, a quarterback with Matt Ryan. I think it's a better situation than he was in this time last year, but lots and lots of concerns. And when we look at positional ADP, where he is going varies where we have him ranked on RotoViz.com, which is wide receiver 38 at this point. There is a 23 positional ADP difference in that. So what are some of your thoughts on Pittman? Is Matt Ryan the savior who takes Pittman from somebody who's solid to that superstar wide receiver? You know, if you're drafting somebody at wide receiver 15 in the second or third round, you're thinking this guy is going to be a top 12 wide receiver at the end of the season. I think there's a very limited upside on where we can see Pittman going. As much as I liked him before the NFL draft and how he performed last year, I think the ADP seems a little askew at the moment for me.
Yeah, so when I think about Matt Ryan, and even when I think about 2021 Carson Wentz, I think part of what made Wentz work well with the Colts last season, and what I think everyone is kind of expecting to make Ryan work well with the Colts this season, is the fact that they have Jonathan Taylor at running back, who you can make the argument that he's now the best running back in football, between just what he offers on the ground, between what he offers through the air. There's a lot of really great ways to implement someone of Jonathan Taylor's talent into an offense, keep things moving, put points on the board, and things of that nature. And then on top of that, the Colts also have a pretty decent defense where hopefully they're going to be playing from ahead in a decent amount of their games, coupled with the fact that they play in a pretty tough division, or a pretty easy division, against teams like the Texans, the Jaguars, and then also the other team that I'm missing right now, the Titans. So when you think about things of that nature, I think we're possibly looking at a Colts team that's still going to prioritize a run as often as they possibly can, with the understanding that they have Matt Ryan kind of there to keep drives alive when they need him to. I don't think that we're going to be looking at a high volume pass offense by any stretch of the imagination when we're considering the Colts. The other thing that I think is interesting with Michael Pittman, when we talk about how he's currently going as the wide receiver 15 in FFPC leagues, one thing that we sometimes have to remind ourselves of is that when we're looking at a player and how they produce in fantasy, we really want to be considering points per game and not overall fantasy points. And Michael Pittman has a really big discrepancy between the two. So when you look and you see that Michael Pittman had 238.6 PPR last season, that's good for the wide receiver 18 overall. You get pretty excited about that. You think, well, if I think Matt Ryan is a little bit better, maybe I can draft him as a wide receiver 15 on the FFPC leagues. Maybe he sneaks into the top 12 or better. We really like what Michael Pittman looks like. But he was the wide receiver 18 in total fantasy points, but then in points per game rank, he was a wide receiver 27, which again, that's kind of what we want to really be looking at here. So he was a low end wide receiver 3 in terms of fantasy points per game on the year. He had 88 receptions for 1,082 yards and 6 touchdowns. By all accounts, a very solid receiver line, one that we certainly want on our team. But do we want to be taking him as a 15th wide receiver of our drafts is really the question that we're trying to ask ourselves here, which is why we're saying that he's probably a wide receiver we should be avoiding at his current ADP. I can't take him that high. I was actually surprised when I saw him on the sheet. I actually asked you in DMs. I was like, "Is Michael Pittman really that bad of a wide receiver to be taking right now?" Because I haven't drafted a lot of him, but that may have just been more of a personal preference thing. I hadn't really stopped to look at his production last season and where he ranked
him. He's going too early.
Yeah, and then I realized that I can't draft him. It's impossible to at this point in time. He's definitely a wide receiver for real life football purposes, who I do like, but I'm kind of out on him right now. If he's falling to me as a wide receiver 15 in drafts, there's going to be other players who I'm going to be willing to take, ahead of him, or maybe I, just take another wide receiver a little bit later than him who I think can possibly give me similar production or better than what he gave last season. So I'm out on Michael Pittman. Wide receiver 15 was very shocking to me. I would actually question if people are looking at total points per game when they're considering this and not, or if they're looking at total points and not points per game when they're considering this, because on a per game basis, he was, like I said, he was a high end wide receiver 3. And then we had some good rookie wide receivers who just came into the league who are probably going to, outproduce Pittman just by the fact that they're high draft capital guys who some of them are on bad teams who are going to probably see a lot of targets. So Pittman at wide receiver 15, I think is a little bit too rich for me.
And I think we'll keep on the trend here off Carson Wentz and wide receivers being paired together. So Terry McLaurin didn't have a really good situation last year at quarterback. I think that's putting it nicely with Tyler Heineke in there. But when we looked in, we were hoping at the start of the season was going to have Ryan Fitzpatrick in there, which I think would have been a lot of fun having him in there. I mentioned Michael Pittman. Terry McLaurin may be one of my favorite wide receivers in the NFL, but in terms of his current ADP and the situation he's in with Carson Wentz, I'm completely out on Wentz. I don't think I was ever in on Wentz at any point, but he is going currently in the late 3rd round over at Underdog at pick 45. He's going to pick 49 over at the FFPC, so very similar range just at the start of the 4th round. In terms of positional ADP, that is wide receiver 18. We have him ranked as wide receiver 33, which is a 15 positional ADP difference at the wide receiver position. In terms of McLaurin, mentioned he has Carson Wentz there this year. I don't know how the quarterback situation is going to play out there. I don't even know if Wentz is going to be the starting quarterback come week 1. So there's a lot of moving parts, and the situation could get better for him. But the offense, how the Commanders have been operating over the last couple of years, I know you're in Washington, so you might have some more inside scoops on this, but I just feel that going in that 3rd, 4th round is way too high for the uncertainty that's arriving here.
Yeah, so the one thing that I think is interesting about Terry McLaurin, I just harped on points per game for Michael Pittman, so let's go ahead and just run it back again. Points per game for Terry McLaurin, he finished 30th in points per game as a rookie, 20th in points per game in 2020, and then 32nd in points per game in 2021, despite each of the last 2 seasons going for over 1,000 yards, 70-plus receptions in each of his last 2 seasons, and a total of 9 touchdowns. He actually also saw a crazy amount of air yards last season, 1,700 from essentially Taylor Heineke throughout the entire course of the year, which I would not have personally expected that number to be that high. To Taylor Heineke's credit, he does love to air the ball out. He just does not have the arm to get it to where it needs to go, which is kind of where I think those who are drafting McLaurin are viewing him as maybe a player who could be on the rise in 2022. Carson Wentz certainly has the deep ball capabilities that Heineke does not, but I mean, we're looking at a guy like Michael Pittman, who he was just, I think it was 27th in points per game last season with Carson Wentz. These are definitely different offenses and different skill position players, but with the Commanders having Antonio Gibson on their team, with them also having Brian Robinson, who they drafted in the 3rd round, they also drafted Jahan Dotson, I believe it's 16th overall pick in the 1st round of this year's draft. Like there's a couple of players who I think were drafted, even though Robinson's not a wide receiver. I think that Washington could very much look to kind of do a similar ball control style of offense that the Colts did with Wentz last season. And if that's the case, I think that could hurt McLaurin's upside overall if we start seeing a little bit more work at the running back position, maybe split between Gibson and Brian Robinson. I don't think we could ignore J.D. McKissick either, who they went back to vulture from the Buffalo Bills after the Bills had reportedly agreed to a deal with McKissick. Washington wanted to get him back, so they did the same there. There's some players on the offensive side of the ball, just in the backfield alone, who I think could get a little bit more opportunity, which could vulture some of McLaurin's 25% target share from last season. And then I think Jahan Dotson is going to obviously factor into this offense as a 1st-round draft pick. And Curtis Samuel's also returning. Curtis Samuel's out for all of last season, essentially. He played a few games, but he might as well have not been on the field. If he's back and he's healthy, which it seems like that's going to be the case right now, I think you also have to include him in the potential list of players who could be eating into what was otherwise a very solid target market share for McLaurin last season and in 2020 as well. He's seen a 25 market share in each of the last 2 seasons, or 25% market share in each of the last 2 seasons. So McLaurin now, he's going as the wide receiver 18. As you mentioned, he's never cracked higher than wide receiver 20. I think that, he's kind of a risky buy at this point in time. I'd be looking to get another guy, maybe of similar value, in the draft, who I think is maybe in a better position, not just from a quarterback standpoint, but then also just a team makeup standpoint. Maybe someone who could have a little less competition for targets, and fade McLaurin there. So I would probably be out on McLaurin right now. I'm not personally drafting a lot of him. And then again, you also, like you said, you factor in the Carson Wentz thing. I think a lot of people are factoring Wentz's upside and his ability to hit McLaurin deep, but you need to factor in the downside as well. I believe over the last 3 seasons, Wentz has averaged roughly a turnover per game when you combine not just his interceptions, but also his fumbles lost. He loses a lot of fumbles. He can be careless at times. So I'm out on McLaurin here as kind of this idea as a mid wide receiver 2.
Yeah, I didn't realize people thought there was upside with Carson Wentz, but that's news to me.
In Washington, they do. In Washington, the Commanders are a 10-win team.
Okay, we'll see how that plays out over the course of the season.
Yes.
Yeah. We also have on the list Amari Cooper, moved in a trade, obviously, before the NFL draft to the Cleveland Browns. The Browns now also traded. They were busy this offseason in terms of the trade market. They traded for Deshaun Watson from the Houston Texans. He is currently going at 44th overall in terms of ADP, and that is in the late 3rd round in terms of where that would fall. Over at the FFPC, then he is going at 53.5. That would be the mid 4th round for him there. But I just think that I think people are looking at this in a way that I talked to you before the show, in terms of sometimes we see the volume play. There is the volume going to be there. He's going to be the wide receiver 1. This is what we see a lot of times with running backs, like say Mike Davis, for example, last year. They don't have any other running backs in Atlanta at the time. He's going to get all the carries. There's so much volume. The volume's going to be great. Nothing happens with Mike Davis throughout the season. I think Amari Cooper feels like that to me. We think he's going to get, there's nobody else there, so he's going to get 200 targets this season. I'm just not sure if there's anything left in the tank for Amari Cooper. One of the biggest red flags for me this offseason with Cooper as well, not just on the performance last year in terms of, I know you're going to talk in a minute about some of the efficient production he had last year, but the Cowboys wanted to get him out of the building for whatever they could get. He is on a very reasonable contract. The Cowboys didn't want him around anymore. And that it's not a case with like Devontae Adams, who the Packers were going to have to pay, and then he actually did want to go and play somewhere else, or a situation where Tyreek Hill was traded away from the Chiefs in those kind of situations. This is very much, we don't want you. We're not having to pay you very much. We have you under a contract, and they moved him out of town. So I think factor in a couple of things. Deshaun Watson, will there be a suspension? Won't there be a suspension? That's obviously going to affect things. I think that's kind of baked into my thought process at the moment. But Amari Cooper for me at the moment feels like we're still hoping that he hits the heights that we hoped when he came out of college, which when he was with the Raiders, I was a massive Amari Cooper fan, hoping that the breakout would come. Then he got to the Cowboys. I thought this is when it's going to happen. But with how his career has moved along, I just think that we kind of know what Amari Cooper is at the moment. His current positional ADP is wide receiver 20. That probably feels like maybe where he should be, but I think that we're like, when I'm at this point of the draft in the late 3rd round, I'm looking at players who are going to become wide receiver 1s, who are ascending talents, who are going to really smash that ADP. And I think that he's a player at that point where he probably finishes wide receiver 16 to wide receiver 30. I think that's probably what happens with him this season. I don't think he has the upside to be a top 12 wide receiver.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be wrestling with the Amari Cooper ADP and the idea of drafting him probably for the better part of the offseason now. If we know Watson's situation over the next couple of weeks, which there's a possibility that we do, maybe that'll just solidify it with me on one way or the other. When I look at some of his numbers from last season, I think that he was overall relatively efficient. He wasn't this guy who blew the world away. He was a wide receiver 29 in points per game at 13.5. He was a wide receiver 21 in fantasy points over expectation. And then he was a wide receiver 30 in expected fantasy points, which is the lowest he's been since 2017. He did not really see a significant target volume. His target volume was literally the lowest it's ever been in his career at a 19% target share, which I think that if we're going to get Watson for the full season, which seems unlikely, that maybe Cooper is a value right now. I would assume, just between the idea of thinking that his market share is probably going to go up a little bit. There's no Jarvis Landry there. There's no Odell Beckham Jr. there. Austin Hooper, I'm sorry. He's gone. I know that he never really absorbed the amount of targets that we thought he was going to get when the Browns made him like one of the highest paid tight ends in league history a few years ago. But he's now gone. They have David Njoku. I'll be curious to see what they do with him. I'm probably a little bit more on the fence with Amari Cooper than you are. There's a part of me that still wants to draft him. He averaged 13.4 points per game as a rookie. He averaged 14.5 points per game his second season, and then he averaged 13.5 points per game last season, like I previously mentioned. So from a points per game standpoint, he didn't exactly fall off this cliff that has me completely out on him, knowing that he's also, I think, going to be 27 this year to enter the season. So he's not even that old of a player. But last season with Dallas was certainly a weird one, just with everything that he saw or didn't see in terms of targets. You made the fact that the point that Dallas also kind of seemed to want him out of the building. I think that's kind of interesting as well. But if the second receiver threatening him for targets is either David Njoku or David Bell, who I think it was a rookie who they drafted, I believe it was the third round this year, then if we have enough of Watson playing this season, then I might be able to talk myself into an argument that maybe Amari Cooper is being a bit undervalued right now. I guess the one question I would ask you, Colm, is given what we know about Amari Cooper right now and his current ADP, which it sits at wide receiver 20 on FFPC leagues, do you think that goes up if an announcement is made that Watson's not going to be suspended for this season? And then on the flip side of that, do you think it drops well below wide receiver 20 if it is announced that Watson gets a 6-game suspension or whatever? I don't quite fully understand how the market may be baking in a potential Watson suspension into Cooper's ADP, which I think is something that needs to also be considered.
Yeah, I think that's baked into my thought process on it at the moment, but I don't think it's baked into some of the current ADP. I think the excitement is that Deshaun Watson is there and he's going to be throwing the ball to Amari Cooper. And like you said, there's not going to be a lot of other options there. You mentioned David Bell. He is the person that I'm drafting on the Browns, trying to target him from that perspective. But I do think, like you mentioned, I think ADP will react to what happens. I think he probably doesn't go up as far. I think he might go up 4 or 5 picks at the wide receiver position, but I think if we know that it's a case that he's missing Deshaun Watson for 6 games, I think he drops down probably around at that point. So I think it's going to be interesting, but at the moment for me, he's somebody with the players that he's going around, with the options that are available around him. And these 3 guys are going kind of within a round and a half to 2 rounds of each other. So some of the other options that I'm really heavily targeting from around that point are, the guys that are in there, Deontay Johnson, TJ Hawkinson is somebody I'm drafting a lot of, DJ Moore is in there. Then we get down below that, I think, like Jerry Jeudy. I know their situation with him at the moment's a bit concerning, but we have Cortland Sutton there as well. And I think they're guys in that range who are very, very interesting. But the one area there that is very intriguing for me when we get to that round is where the likes of Lamar Jackson's going off the board, Joe Burrow's going off the board, Patrick Mahomes going off the board, Justin Herbert. I'm not going and taking Amari Cooper over Lamar Jackson this year. That's for certain. So I think there's a lot of players in that range in terms of how I'm building out my drafts that I'm going there at that point for one of the other wide receivers. But we talked earlier this week about the running backs going in this range as well. And you have the likes of Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins. They're all players that I'm targeting with the upside at that point. So that's another reason why not only do I think their ADP is currently too high, but the other options that I'm drafting in those ranges. We're going to give a bonus 2 more just to mention. We're not going to dive into these right now, but Allen Robinson is somebody who is going in the mid-4th round at 53 in terms of selection on Underdog, and over at the FFPC, he's going 64th player off the board in the mid-5th round. I just think that people are building too much expectation into him landing with the Rams. I think always a concern for me is when a player decides that he doesn't really want to play anymore for one team. Maybe it's just that he didn't want to play for the Bears, but it's very hard to reignite that fire for him to be ready to go this season. Obviously, the Rams with Cooper Kupp was an electric offense last year, but I don't think Allen Robinson is going to come in and just light the world up. I think he's going to be capped at that how Odell Beckham did last year, which was pretty solid, but it's not going to be delivering you a mid-4th round ADP in this season. And the other player they mentioned, it's a good bit further down. It's in the mid-8th round, is Allen Lazard, and I'm a Green Bay Packers fan, so I'm, with all my Packers love and my heart, I think that's much too early for where he's been drafted. We did talk about this a little bit earlier before we started talking. You mentioned that Robert Tonyan and Christian Watson are going within a round of Allen Lazard. So I think, in my opinion, there I'm going again for the younger player, the rookie, the upside. Maybe it doesn't work out with Christian Watson there. Maybe he doesn't hit the potential in year one. Maybe he never hits that potential, but it's that thing of who has the upside, who's going to really outperform that ADP, who could be a top 24 wide receiver out of those two guys. In my opinion, it's probably not Lazard, and I take that upshot on Watson there in the mid-8th round. But those are the final two guys that I wanted to throw in as a bonus. But have you anything that you want to slot in, Zach, on those two guys?
No, not a whole lot. I think you kind of covered it. I am looking just real quick now at the ADPs and some of the ranges where some of these other players are being taken. I'm kind of also still thinking back to our Amari Cooper conversation. But you mentioned that you have guys like Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, going in that round of Cooper, and also, Allen Robinson as well. They're literally just the 3 picks off of where Robinson is going. So it all kind of fits into this conversation pretty well, I think. Just when you think about the idea of maybe a Watson suspension does move Cooper down, we're going to really be hoping that we drafted those guys ahead of him if that actually does happen. But then the other thing I think about too, when we're talking about suspensions, looking at where Marquise Brown is being drafted, I know this is supposed to be a don't draft these players show, so I'm not going to switch the narrative here. But Marquise Brown is going at ADP of 61.8. It's just after Amari Cooper and just after Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton. Don't forget that, DeAndre Hopkins actually is suspended for 6 games. And Marquise Brown, who they traded for during the draft from the Ravens, he's probably going to have a chance to be the wide receiver 1 for the Cardinals for at least the first 6 weeks of the season. He may even end up being closer to that wide receiver 1 for the Cardinals throughout the majority of the year. So when we're fading someone like Allen Robinson, who we know is going to be, I think it's 29 years old to start this season. As you mentioned, he basically kind of sat out last year with the Bears too. That may be a little bit of a red flag. Someone like Marquise Brown could actually be a big value over these guys who we're essentially not advocating for. So when I look at some of these names and players who we're seeing are overvalued, I think there are definitely some undervalued guys in there, like you mentioned with Jeudy and Sutton. I think Marquise Brown very much so also falls into that category as a guy who's undervalued right now, given what we already know about his situation with Hopkins being out.
Yeah, and a lot of this is this player versus this player, like the 1v1s and the 2v2s for when you're drafting as to how you want your roster to look at the end of it. But you hit on a couple of good names there. But you mentioned Marquise Brown. I think he's going to have a big season, but Rondell Moore is the wide receiver to be drafting over in Arizona for 2022.
I hope so.